light of the airstrikes conducted by the US, the UK and France on Syria, purportedly in response to the alleged chemical weapons attacks in eastern Douma, we've seen bizarre statements and arguments fired across both sides. In this chapter of International, we're going to be looking at these arguments and how they play out, and how they feed into narratives on both sides, geopolitical, but also in terms of the human cost of the conflict in Syria. So the first argument pushed forward by people who are pro-airstrikes, the do something crowd, is the argument that the left, a term generally used, are in favour of Russian imperialism, but not in favour of the West, which is a really strange argument to make. So you're anti-Russian imperialism, so that means that we should welcome a whole new set of actors whom we know have rather disingenuous claims on the conflict in Syria, and are not acting out of any degree of humanitarian impulse, have been themselves encouraging the conflagration and spreading of the conflict via secret or covert CIA programs, as well as their proxies in the region, Saudi Arabia, Qatar and others. It's a spurious argument to make. Surely the idea of opposing imperialism, if we're going to use that as a category, is to oppose all forms of imperialism, but not to argue that the answer to Russian aggression and Iranian aggression is the welcoming in of other actors that would extend and expand the conflict.
We have to understand how this happened. This happened because of us. These 600,000 are not just incidental. We started a war to overthrow a regime. It was covert. It was Timber Sycamore. People can look it up, the CIA operation, together with Saudi Arabia. Still it's shrouded in secrecy, which is part of the problem in our country. A major war effort, shrouded in secrecy, never debated by Congress, never explained to the American people, signed by President Obama, never explained. And this created chaos. And so just throwing more missiles in right now is not a response.
My only concern...
We need to go, it's, by the way, not to walk away, to go to the UN Security Council, as the Admiral says, to agree with Russia on a strategy for ending the fight. But ending the fight means that we stop trying to overthrow a government, that we stop trying to support rebels who are committed to overthrowing the government. That is where this war continues, because we, to this day, back rebels that are trying to overthrow a government contrary to international law, contrary to the UN Charter, contrary to common sense, contrary to practical path. We can't do it. And it's just creating ongoing crisis to the extent of facing an imminent confrontation with Russia.
The idea of cost. One of the problems with the way in which the debate around Syria, whether it was 7 years ago or today, is the idea that the Syrian crisis can be averted through a humanitarian intervention without outlining to people in Western countries, the populations, about the idea of cost. To intervene would spark chaos, instability, a set of political consequences of which no one anywhere can foresee. This is one of the reasons why Russia and Iran have been able to have such a consistent and effective strategy. They have really concise aims and have been able to achieve these concise aims in a strategic, steady manner. They know what they want, and they've seized the opportunity to take it. But people who make the argument in favour of intervention or even limited airstrikes are unable to be honest with populations about the cost that would be paid in removing Assad. This isn't about whether removing Assad is a good idea or a bad idea. It's about people who suggest that removing Assad would not result in a huge loss of life, whether that be Syrian life or troops that we were to send in, or any no-fly zone that we'd have to enforce through air defence systems or special forces, the huge amounts of death tolls when it comes to sectarian violence, people who support Assad at the moment because they're afraid of what happens when the Syrian state will collapse in terms of ethnic minorities, religious minorities. These are all a cost which has been disguised for whatever purpose. People are able to use the 600,000 people that have died, the millions that have been sent into exile, as a tool Arab life, when arguing for humanitarian purposes, is always a tool used by people on political sides to push forward an agenda. And the most scoundrel way of doing that is to suggest that people on the other side of the argument don't care about human life. Our responsibilities to humanity are vital, but we also need to frame them not just in terms of what we see on the surface, but the underlying geopolitics. We know that all players in Syria have their desires, their geopolitical strategy for the future. Russia wants a warm water port. It wants to be able to resurrect itself as the representative of the resistance against Western imperialism, namely as of the US as the unipolar power in the world. Iran wants to conduct this idea of forward defense to protect Tehran. Iranians and Afghan Shia militiamen, as well as revolutionary guards and Shia militiamen from Iraq, should die defending Damascus. The fear that Iran will be surrounded, because of course that is the stated aim of Western powers, namely the US, the UK, France, whose client states, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and United Arab Emirates and Kuwait, among others. Their desire in Syria is not necessarily to set up a beacon to democracy. It's always the geopolitical aim of ensuring Saudi domination over the region. This is the difficulty with the inherent contradictions of the moral debate. We see moral outrage at what the Saudis are doing in Yemen. We also see moral outrage at Assad's actions in Syria, as well as the actions of many rebel groups. But it's vital to understand the context in which these events occur, because if we don't, we'll end up making a mistake and supporting actions that will cause a greater conflagration in the region. Finally, we have the issue of selective serialization of the debate. There's been this worrying trend over the past week, 2 weeks, of journalists coming out and using particular sections of the Syrian exile community or internal community to justify their narrative within the Syrian conflict. Whether it's Syrians based in Istanbul, Beirut, Germany, the UK or the US, some journalists like to use Syrian voices and command that we pay attention to them because those Syrian voices happen to follow a line of logic that those journalists would like us to follow.
كانت على النظام، كانت ضربات ضد الشعب السوري أكثر ما كانت ضد النظام وضد الثورة السورية، والأماكن اللي انضربت للنظام كلها كانت فاضية، والنظام ما طالع أي صور أو طالع أو على صفحاتهم إنه في أضرار له. هلا الضربة الأمريكية ما أثرت النظام أبداً، ضربة عادية جداً، لأني على موجب التصاريح اللي صرحوها تعتبر هن دول عظمى مثل أمريكا وبريطانيا وفرنسا. على التصاريح والشيء اللي طالعوه البيانات إنه توقعنا إنه ضربة تقسم ظهر النظام السوري.
Others who support the Assad regime would suggest that we listen to Syrian sources that are of that bent. Surely we should listen to all Syrians because the picture is complicated. Amongst the people that I have made contact with, whether in the UK, the US and Germany, they happen to be Syrians who would prefer the Assad government to not be there or are cautious of rebels. At least they want a Syria that is stable and free. Amongst people that I know in Beirut and in Damascus and in other parts of Syria, there's a feeling of not necessarily enthusiasm for Assad, but also the idea that they had been fearful of the West's designs. They are conscious of the geopolitical machinations of all players, whether those who support Assad or those who are against Assad. Especially affects those who are in the religious and ethnic minorities within Syria, as well as sections of the Sunni middle class and Sunni working class, as well as Sunni rural populations, who are fearful of the collapse of the Syrian state. Privately, they'll tell you that they're not happy about the lack of freedoms, or the way in which the Assads and the many other wealthy families surrounding the Assads have monopolized power. But they are wary of the designs of outsiders from all quarters. It's important to listen to all Syrian voices to get a broader picture of what's going on, as well as people's motives.